It was a bright morning as the doors of Flight 221 opened, welcoming passengers aboard for a journey across the skies. Among the crowd entering the plane were Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, an elderly black couple with a quiet dignity. They walked together, hand in hand, their heads held high as they made their way toward the first-class cabin. The sight of them entering the premium section, however, caught the eye of head flight attendant Sarah Mitchell, who was standing near the entrance, preparing to greet passengers. The couple's well-dressed appearance and confident stride suggested nothing out of the ordinary, but Sarah, unfortunately, was quick to make assumptions. As she watched Mr. and Mrs. Johnson approach, a quiet judgment formed in her mind. She assumed they didn't belong in first class. Without checking the passenger list, Sarah confidently stepped forward to block their path, instructing them to go to the economy section. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her tone polite but firm. "This is the first-class cabin. I believe you've been assigned to economy." Mr. Johnson, a seasoned traveler who had seen much in his life, stood still for a moment. Mrs. Johnson, with a soft but assured smile, looked at Sarah. "We've been assigned here," he said calmly, his voice steady. "Our tickets are for first class." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She glanced at their attire and, without a second thought, insisted again that they were mistaken. She had made up her mind based on their appearance alone, relying on a deep-rooted prejudice that assumed they didn't belong in such a lavish space. Sarah had failed to check the list, ignoring the crucial fact that first-class passengers had tickets, not just appearances. As the couple stood there, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, murmurs began to rise from the nearby passengers. Some began to voice their discomfort with the situation, but Sarah's arrogance overshadowed their concerns. She remained steadfast, only further deepening the discomfort in the AIR.IT was a moment where discrimination had silently reared its ugly head, not with overt hostility, but with a quiet, passive judgment that disregarded the worth of two passengers based on nothing but assumptions. Would Sarah's mistake remain unchallenged, or would this encounter spark something far deeper? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. The truth will come to light, and what follows may just surprise everyone. The air inside the cabin grew heavier as Mr. and Mrs. Johnson stood their ground, still facing Sarah Mitchell's resistance. Their composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the flight attendant's dismissive attitude. They had been through far worse in life, but this was an insult they hadn't expected on a journey that was supposed to be about comfort and rest. Mr. Johnson, with his deep voice and quiet strength, reached into his coat pocket. His hand emerged, holding two first-class tickets. He offered them to Sarah with the same calm expression that had never wavered since the confrontation began. There was no anger in his eyes, only a steady resolve to correct the misunderstanding. Sarah hesitated. She took the tickets but made no effort to glance at them. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the elderly couple, studying them as if they had some secret she had yet to uncover. The flight attendant's refusal to believe the legitimacy of their tickets was clear, but she didn't voice her suspicion openly. Instead, she turned to the side, as if searching for an answer in the air around her. She couldn't fathom that a couple like them had been assigned first class, and her uncertainty was only growing. "Are you sure these are yours?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now, though still tinged with disbelief. Mr. Johnson didn't flinch. "They are ours. You can check the reservation if you need to." Mrs. Johnson, her voice soothing yet firm, added, "We've paid for these seats like any other passenger. Please, we're not here to cause trouble." But Sarah's mind was already made up. She looked at the tickets again, only to set them aside. "It's just, there's no way you were assigned first class," she murmured. Almost to herself, a tense silence hung over the scene. The passengers around them began to take note. Some were still absorbed in their reading or conversations, but others had begun to watch the drama unfold. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. "I saw them in the economy line earlier," a voice spoke from somewhere near the middle of the cabin. "I think they're lying." Another voice chimed in, its tone dismissive and cold. But then, someone else spoke up. "No, wait a minute. I saw their tickets too. They're for first class." A debate started to form as some passengers began to support Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, while others rallied behind Sarah, seemingly blind to the injustice unfolding before their eyes. The tension in the air thickened like a storm cloud, casting a dark shadow over the once serene cabin. In the midst of this growing uncertainty, Emily Parker, a new flight attendant, stepped out from the galley. She had been observing the situation from a distance, and her heart immediately sank. She knew the Johnsons. She recognized them instantly. They weren't just any passengers. They were well-known members of the community, respected for their work and their long-standing efforts to make a difference. Mrs. Johnson was a retired educator, and Mr. Johnson had spent decades as an advocate for civil rights. Emily had heard their names in various charity events, and she knew exactly who they were. But even with this knowledge, Emily hesitated. She had been trained to follow protocol, to adhere to the rules without question. And in this moment, as she watched Sarah's unwavering stance, Emily's nerves threatened to betray her. Her eyes flickered between Sarah and the elderly couple. She felt a sickening sense of unease knot in her stomach. Emily had always prided herself on standing up for what was right. But now, in this instance, her loyalty to her colleague seemed to outweigh her moral compass. Her gaze shifted to the other passengers. Some were still watching the situation with interest. Others were already pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Emily's heart raced, and she could feel her palms growing sweaty. She knew this was wrong. She knew Sarah's actions were unjust. But she was paralyzed by fear. What if speaking out meant losing her job? What if she was wrong and everyone else sided with Sarah? Emily could already feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The tension reached a boiling point when Mr. Johnson spoke again, his voice much firmer this time. "We've been through this kind of thing before. You don't know who we are, but I'm telling you, we're not going anywhere." His words were laced with quiet authority, and there was a deep sadness in them that was hard to ignore. Sarah stood frozen, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. She still didn't believe them. It was as though her mind refused to accept the idea that a couple like the Johnsons could afford such luxury. To Sarah, this was about more than just first-class tickets. It was about the subtle, ugly prejudices she had harbored for years. And in this moment, she wasn't ready to confront them. The murmurs of support for Mr. and Mrs. Johnson grew louder, but so did the whispers from those siding with Sarah. One passenger finally stood up from their seat, walking over to Emily. "You should do something about this. This is getting uncomfortable," the passenger said, their tone sharp. Emily could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She turned away, unable to meet their gaze. "I'm sorry," Emily murmured, as though apologizing for something she had no control over. Her voice barely reached above the noise around her. She couldn't bring herself to step in. She couldn't bring herself to speak the truth, even though it was clear as day. Mrs. Johnson caught Emily's eye for just a brief moment. There was no anger in her expression, only the deep understanding of someone who had lived through this kind of rejection far too many times. But her gaze spoke volumes, and for a brief second, Emily felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. It was too late now. The moment had passed, and as Emily slowly retreated back into the galley, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside her had broken. She had failed to do what she knew was right. And so, the story of Mr. and Mrs. Johnson continued to unfold. A story of quiet dignity in the face of rejection and suspicion, of prejudices challenged but not yet overcome. Would anyone step up to make things right? Would the flight continue with a sense of justice restored? Only time would tell, but one thing was for sure. The tension had only just begun to simmer. The murmurs in the cabin reached a crescendo, and the atmosphere thickened with palpable tension. The passengers were still divided, some still silently supporting Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, others increasingly suspicious of the elderly couple, leaning into the whispers that clung to the air like a thick fog. Sarah Mitchell, her frustration mounting, finally reached her breaking point. She couldn't tolerate this humiliation any longer. With a sharp breath, she turned to one of the flight attendants nearby and gave a curt order. "Call security," Sarah said, her voice steely, betraying none of the internal turmoil she felt. She stood tall, her hands clasped tightly at her sides, as though this final action would somehow validate the authority she believed she had lost in front of the passengers. "These two need to be removed from first class." The flight attendant hesitated but quickly moved to comply, her steps fast and urgent as she disappeared down the aisle. Sarah's eyes never left Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. The couple hadn't moved an inch. They remained calm, their faces betraying none of the panic or distress that Sarah had anticipated. If anything, their stillness only made her feel more unsettled, more out of place. She couldn't understand it. Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they argue more? Was this a trick? Mr. Johnson, however, seemed unaffected by Sarah's growing agitation. With a composed and unhurried motion, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. The world around him seemed to slow down, the noise of the murmurs and whispers fading into the background. He didn't need to look at the phone's screen as his thumb swiped across it. The call was already being dialed. Mrs. Johnson's eyes locked with Sarah's, and for a split second, there was a flicker of understanding between them. It was as though Mrs. Johnson could sense exactly what her husband was about to do, and her calm demeanor matched his. She gently rested her hand on Mr. Johnson's arm as he held the phone to his ear, his posture still straight and dignified. Sarah's gaze grew even more hostile, but she said nothing. She simply stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, waiting for security to arrive. It was an odd silence that filled the space between them, heavy with anticipation, as the passengers held their breath. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Johnson spoke. His voice was low, almost too quiet for the tension that filled the cabin, but it held a weight that commanded attention. "Yes, this is Mr. Johnson. I need you to confirm something for me. Could you please verify something on your records?" He paused, his voice even and unshaken. "Could you confirm the identities of the owners of this airline?" Sarah's face faltered, her eyes narrowing in confusion as Mr. Johnson continued to speak, his tone polite yet firm. There was a brief pause before Mr. Johnson's voice cut through the silence again. "Thank you. Yes, that's correct. I'll wait." He lowered the phone slightly but didn't hang up, keeping his gaze fixed steadily ahead. Mrs. Johnson's fingers gently squeezed his arm, offering him her quiet support. Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching longer as Sarah's impatience grew. Her gaze darted around the cabin, not daring to make eye contact with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. She kept glancing at the door, as though expecting security to arrive at any moment, ready to settle the matter once and for all. But there was an uncomfortable realization growing inside her, a feeling that she couldn't shake, that she might have made a grave mistake. Finally, the phone buzzed with an incoming notification, and Mr. Johnson, still calm, raised the phone to his ear again. His voice was clear and steady as he spoke. "Thank you for confirming that," he said simply. He paused for a moment, then glanced up at Sarah Mitchell, his expression calm but piercing. "I believe you were inquiring about the owners of this airline, weren't you?" Sarah's eyes widened in realization, her mind scrambling to process what had just happened. She opened her mouth to speak but could find no words. The room seemed to close in around her. The passengers, sensing something was amiss, grew quieter. A heavy silence settled over them like a blanket. Mr. Johnson held the phone up, allowing Sarah to hear a voice on the other end, the tone formal and authoritative. "Good afternoon, Ms. Mitchell. This is David Brooks, head of security at Airline name. I'm confirming that Mr. and Mrs. Johnson are indeed the owners of this airline. Please ensure they are treated with the utmost respect and that any further inconvenience is avoided. You may clear up any misunderstanding with them directly." The words from the phone seemed to echo in the cabin, sending shockwaves through the air. Sarah's face drained of color. The heat in her cheeks was no longer from anger, but from the realization that she had made a grave error. The truth had just been laid bare, and the weight of her assumption, the very prejudice that had fueled her actions, was now staring her square in the face. For a moment, no one moved. The reality of the situation hung in the air, palpable and undeniable. Sarah stood frozen, unable to speak. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, however, stood as they had before, unmoved by the chaos that was swirling around them. They had already known the truth that no one had bothered to see. Finally, Mr. Johnson spoke again, his voice just as calm as before. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. I appreciate your assistance." He ended the call, and as the phone slipped back into his pocket, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do, what to say. Everything had unraveled so quickly, and she was left standing in the wreckage of her own assumptions. She opened her mouth, but her words came out in a whisper. I didn't know." Mr. Johnson met her gaze, his voice steady but edged with a quiet sadness. "You didn't take the time to find out, Ms. Mitchell. That's the problem." A deep silence followed, one that lingered in the cabin, heavy with the weight of truth. Passengers, who had been watching in suspense, began to exchange glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others ashamed, but all of them were now aware of the painful lesson that had unfolded before them. Sarah slowly stepped back, retreating toward the galley with her head hung low. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson finally took their seats in the first-class cabin. The passengers, once so divided, were now silent. No one spoke as the plane continued its journey, but the memory of what had just occurred would linger with them for much longer than the flight itself. It wasn't just about first-class tickets anymore. It was about respect, assumptions, and the harsh truth that would forever change the way they viewed the world around them. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the galley, her back against the cold, metallic wall. The weight of what had just unfolded pressed down on her chest like a 1,000-pound boulder. Her mind spun in a vortex of disbelief and guilt. How had it come to this? How had she gone so far, insulting the very people she should have respected? The owners, she could barely process the magnitude of her mistake. The unease that had simmered beneath her professional exterior now bubbled to the surface, and she couldn't seem to contain the overwhelming wave of emotions crashing over her. There were no words left, just a profound shame gnawing at her insides. From across the aisle, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson remained seated, calm and collected, almost as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Sarah knew better now. She knew they were not just any ordinary passengers. They were the very ones she had disrespected in her haste to uphold an unfounded assumption. And her thoughts turned to that pivotal question. What if they hadn't been the owners? Would I have treated them differently? As Sarah stood there, lost in self-loathing, the elderly couple remained quietly poised in their seats. Their demeanor, still unwavering, seemed to provoke more questions than answers in Sarah's mind. She had assumed her actions were justified, that her decisions were based on protocol and professionalism. But now, she saw it all through a different lens. Mr. Johnson was the first to break the silence. He stood, slowly, deliberately, with a quiet grace that seemed to demand attention. Mrs. Johnson followed, gently placing a hand on her husband's arm. Her eyes locked onto Sarah from across the cabin. They approached her, not with anger, but with an air of resolve. An air that held a quiet power Sarah could not ignore. "Ms. Mitchell," Mr. Johnson began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of wisdom that only age and experience could provide. "You're shocked. I can see it in your face. But this is not the first time something like this has happened to us." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening as the reality of the situation set in. She wanted to respond, to apologize, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say to undo the damage she had caused? Mrs. Johnson spoke next, her voice soft yet firm. "We didn't want to make a scene, Sarah," she said gently. "We could have easily revealed who we were when we boarded. But we didn't. We don't flaunt our position. We don't want special treatment because of who we are. We simply wanted to see how people like you, the people who represent this airline, would treat us. To see if you would respect us as human beings, not based on our status." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief, a flush of guilt spreading across her cheeks. She hadn't thought of it that way. She had only seen them as two elderly passengers, too quick to judge, too blinded by her assumptions to see what lay beneath the surface. They weren't trying to make a spectacle. They were testing the very system she worked for, the system that she believed upheld fairness and equality. And yet, here she was, the one who had failed that test. Mr. Johnson continued, his eyes steady, but the words that came next were the ones that hit Sarah like a thunderclap. "Tell me something, Sarah?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly quiet, yet filled with the weight of generations of injustice. "If we weren't the owners of this airline, would you have treated us differently?" The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, so thick that Sarah felt as if she couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on her, the faces of the passengers now nothing more than blurry outlines. She was trapped, not by the situation, but by her own conscience. Could she answer? Should she answer? Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say no, that she would have treated them with respect regardless. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. The truth was too painful to admit. She had acted on her own bias, influenced by her assumptions and preconceived notions. And now, faced with the raw reality of her actions, there was no escaping the truth. Mr. Johnson watched her, his gaze unwavering. "It's a question that people like us ask every day, Sarah. In every moment, in every interaction. Would you have treated us differently if we weren't who we are?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her heart pound in her chest, her stomach knotting with anxiety. Every fiber of her being wanted to apologize, to offer an explanation, but she couldn't. Words couldn't undo the damage. They couldn't take back the harm she had caused, not just to them, but to herself. She had betrayed her own values, her own sense of integrity. And there was no turning back from that. "I'm sorry," Sarah finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible, barely a breath. It was all she could say. She could feel the sincerity behind the words, but they seemed so small, so inadequate in the face of what she had done. Mrs. Johnson smiled, though there was no warmth in it, just a quiet sadness. "It's not about the apology, Sarah," she said softly. "It's about understanding. It's about realizing that people like us, people of color, we're constantly faced with these questions. Not just about our status or our wealth, but about how we're treated based on the color of our skin, the way we speak, or the way we look. We carry that with us every day. And all we ask, all we've ever asked, is that people treat us the same as they would treat anyone else." Mr. Johnson nodded. "We wanted to see if you could look past the exterior, if you could see us for who we truly are, without your assumptions clouding your judgment." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the sting of her ignorance deep within her. She had been blinded by prejudice, by the very biases she had tried so hard to deny. And now, in the quiet aftermath, she could no longer ignore the truth. The painful truth that she had been part of the problem. When she finally opened her eyes again, she saw Mr. and Mrs. Johnson standing before her, their faces soft but resolute. They weren't angry. They weren't seeking vengeance. They were simply offering a lesson, one that Sarah would never forget. Now, it's up to you, Sarah, Mr. Johnson said. How you move forward from here. It's your choice. You can change, you can learn, or you can stay the same. But remember this, we're all human. And that's what truly matters. With those final words, the couple turned and walked back to their seats. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing, her heart heavy with the weight of their words. The truth had been laid bare, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah truly understood the power of humility, of empathy, and of seeing people not for their status, but for their humanity. The rest of the flight was silent, not out of discomfort, but because everyone on board had been changed in some small way by what had just transpired. And as the plane continued its journey, so too did Sarah. She had been awakened. The flight was nearing its descent, the seatbelt signs flickering on as the stewardesses started preparing for landing. But Sarah Mitchell's mind was a whirlwind, her thoughts racing faster than the plane's descent. The events that had unfolded were still vivid in her mind. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's calm resolve, their gentle yet powerful words, the painful truth she had learned. It was all still so fresh as the plane settled into its final approach. Sarah remained seated in the galley, her hands gripping the edges of the counter. Emily Parker, the new flight attendant, approached hesitantly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Sarah. Emily began softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say something. Sarah glanced up at her, seeing the confusion and apprehension in the young woman's eyes. She had noticed Emily's discomfort earlier, how she had stood silently, unsure of whether to speak up when the confrontation had escalated. I'm sorry too, Emily, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. I should have never let that happen. I should have known better. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes softening. I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, but what happened, it was hard to watch. You judged them before even giving them a chance. Sarah's heart clenched at the truth of Emily's words. She hadn't meant to judge. She hadn't meant to let her own prejudices cloud her judgment. But she had, and it had cost her more than just her pride. It had opened her eyes to the painful reality of the biases she had carried for so long. The plane landed smoothly, the rush of passengers eager to disembark soon filling the air. But Sarah, instead of joining the usual post-flight hustle, was instead called to the front of the aircraft, where Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were waiting. Their presence was not a source of anger but one of calm. They stood there, waiting for her, as if offering the opportunity for something much more important than a simple apology. Sarah walked toward them. Her heart thudded in her chest. The moment she had dreaded was now upon her. She was certain she would lose her job, that she would be reprimanded, perhaps even fired for her behavior. But she was also ready for whatever came next. She had learned the hard way that facing consequences, no matter how painful, was the first step toward growth. Sarah, Mr. Johnson began, his voice low and steady. You've made a mistake, but we're not here to punish you. We believe in second chances, in redemption. Sarah blinked, confused. What do you mean? I don't deserve. Mrs. Johnson interrupted gently, her smile soft but firm. We could fire you, Sarah. We could end this right now and move on. But instead, we're going to give you a chance to do something much more valuable. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Was this some kind of trick? Were they just giving her false hope before the inevitable? We want you to lead a training session, Mr. Johnson continued, as if reading her mind. A training session for all of the flight attendants. A session on how to combat prejudice, on how to provide fair and respectful service to every passenger, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their status. Sarah's heart began to pound. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed that they would want her gone, that the damage was irreparable. But here they were, offering her the chance to make things right, to turn her mistake into something meaningful. But why? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Why would you give me this chance? Mrs. Johnson's gaze softened. Because we believe in your potential, Sarah. We see something in you that you might not even see in yourself. You've made a mistake, yes, but that mistake doesn't define you. It's what you do afterward that matters. Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement. We've had our share of challenges, Sarah. We've faced prejudice, judgment, and discrimination for much of our lives. But we know that change doesn't come from firing people. It comes from helping them understand, helping them grow. And we think you have the ability to lead that change. Sarah stood there in stunned silence, the weight of their words sinking in. They weren't offering her an escape from her mistakes. They weren't pretending that what had happened didn't matter. But they were offering her something far more valuable. A chance to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone she worked with. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I know I can't undo what happened, but I will do my best to make this right. I'll lead the session. I'll do whatever it takes to learn from this and to teach others to never make the same mistake. The relief that flooded through her was immediate, like a wave crashing into the shore. She had thought she would be cast aside, discarded as an example of failure. But instead, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were giving her a platform. A chance to not just change her own mindset, but to change the mindset of her colleagues as well. As the realization settled in, Sarah felt something else stirring within her. It wasn't just gratitude or relief. It was a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about saving her job or making amends for her actions. This was about something much bigger. It was about breaking down the walls of prejudice that divided people. Something that she now understood with painful clarity. "We'll be with you every step of the way," Mr. Johnson said, his voice warm and encouraging. "This isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about the entire team. It's about making sure that this airline, this company we built, reflects the values we stand for: equality, respect, and dignity for all." Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in me." As the last of the passengers filed out of the cabin, Sarah stood there for a moment, alone with her thoughts. It felt like a new chapter, a fresh start. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead would be challenging. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. The training session she would lead wasn't just a chance for redemption. It was a chance to make a real, lasting impact. Sarah was determined to rise to the challenge, to learn, to grow, and to help others understand the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. And as the doors of the aircraft closed, she took a deep breath, ready to begin her journey of change. Weeks passed since the confrontation that changed Sarah Mitchell's life forever. The once confident and self-assured flight attendant who had relied on her assumptions and biases was now a different person. The weight of the lessons she had learned had become a part of her, reshaping her outlook on life and her approach to the world around her. Sarah had thrown herself into the challenge. The training she had led for the entire flight attendant team had been eye-opening, both for her and her colleagues. They had discussed prejudice in its many forms, how it could arise from appearance, social status, and personal biases. But more importantly, they had explored how to break down those barriers. It wasn't just about providing service. It was about offering respect, dignity, and fairness to every passenger, regardless of who they were. Sarah had started to serve her passengers with a new sense of sincerity. She no longer made assumptions based on their appearance or background. Instead, she greeted each person with a warm smile, taking the time to make them feel valued. The change was gradual but noticeable. The passengers began to respond differently to her, grateful for the kindness, the attention to detail, and the respect she now showed them. Her colleagues, too, began to see the difference. Emily Parker, once unsure and silent during the tense confrontation, now found herself looking up to Sarah with admiration. She noticed how Sarah interacted with everyone, no longer dismissing anyone as less important, but instead engaging with each person in a way that felt personal and meaningful. As the company-wide training sessions continued, the ripple effect of Sarah's transformation spread through the airline. Other departments adopted similar strategies, focusing on inclusivity and creating an environment where every employee felt empowered to treat others with fairness. Sarah had not only redeemed herself, but had helped others along the way. She had become a symbol of change, an example that anyone could learn and grow from their mistakes if they were willing to confront them. It was on a quiet afternoon, after another successful flight, when Mrs. Johnson invited Sarah into the VIP lounge for a cup of tea. Sarah had hesitated at first, unsure of what Mrs. Johnson's intentions were. But when she saw the gentle smile on Mrs. Johnson's face, she understood. This was more than just a gesture. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a symbol of the forgiveness that had been extended to her. Sarah set down the tray with 2 cups of tea and sat across from Mrs. Johnson, her hands trembling slightly. The warmth of the tea seeped into her palms, offering a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. As she took a sip, she glanced up at Mrs. Johnson, who was watching her with kind eyes, the weight of their shared history between them. "I've learned so much since that day," Sarah began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I used to think I knew everything. I thought I understood what it meant to treat people fairly, but I was wrong. I judged people based on their appearances, their status. I didn't see the bigger picture." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her smile soft. "It's easy to fall into that trap, Sarah. But the important thing is that you've learned from it, and you're making a real difference. That's what matters." Sarah took another sip of her tea, reflecting on the journey she had been on. "I never thought it would be so hard to confront my own biases. But it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And yet, it's also been the most rewarding. I've learned that prejudice doesn't just hurt others, it hurts me too. It makes me blind to the beauty of the world and the people around me." Mrs. Johnson placed her cup down gently and leaned forward slightly. "You've made a shift from within, Sarah. That's what true change looks like. It's not about pretending to be perfect. It's about recognizing our flaws and working to correct them. And you've done just that. You're not the same person you were before." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. "I'm not perfect. I still have a lot to learn. But I'm committed to doing better every day. I want to be someone who treats others with the respect they deserve, no matter where they come from or what they look like." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly, her eyes full of pride. "I see that, and that's why I'm so proud of you. Take strength to change, to admit when we're wrong, and to take action. And you've done all of that." The conversation lingered in the air, and Sarah felt a sense of peace settle within her. She had spent so long doubting herself, questioning her worth after the incident with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. But now, she understood that it wasn't about her mistakes. It was about what she did afterward, the lessons she had learned and the effort she had put into making things right. As Sarah stood to leave, Mrs. Johnson handed her a small, neatly folded napkin with the words "respect, dignity, equality" written in elegant script. It was a simple gesture, but to Sarah, it meant the world. It was a reminder of everything she had learned and everything she still had to do. "You're on the right path, Sarah," Mrs. Johnson said softly. "Keep going, and never forget the lesson you've learned. Prejudice, arrogance, and the lack of respect only divide us. But kindness, understanding, and empathy bring us together." Sarah nodded, her heart full. She knew that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly committed to making the world a better place. One act of respect at a time. As she walked out of the lounge, a sense of peace washed over her. The weight of her past mistakes had been replaced by a newfound purpose. She had learned the value of respect, the power of humility, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. And she was ready to share those lessons with the world, one passenger at a time. If you found this story moving and educational, and want to continue learning more about how to overcome prejudice and foster respect in your own life, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Follow along for more inspiring stories, practical advice, and lessons that will help you grow into the best version of yourself.